Okay, so welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. This session is Indigenous Storytelling, Fulfilling the Outcomes in the New ELA Curriculum. And this is brought to you by the Alberta Regional Professional Development Consortia, or ARPDC. I belong to the Edmonton Regional Learning Consortium, which is one of the 7 that belong to the entire consortium. And we're funded by Learn Alberta. Do land acknowledgement first before we get going. So Tansei, I live on Treaty 7 land, the ancestral home of Blackfoot people. There are also Dene and Métis Nation Region 5, which has changed just since our last elections. People here as well, which I belong to. All have contributed to the shaping of Alberta and Canada, and I thank the Blackfoot for allowing me to live on their land. If you know which treaty area you live on or by, or if you know which people were displaced from the land that your school is on, you can put that in the chat if you'd like. Just introduce myself. If you haven't been to one of my sessions before, if you have, please bear with me. My name is Tammy Johnson, and I am with ARPDC, called the Designer of Professional Learning, which I think is an apt term that they're using for us now, as you know, besides these online sessions that we provide for Teacher PD, we also do in-person sessions, workshops, and presentations, as well as some curriculum areas that we work in developing. Awesome. So let me just post it there. Treaty 6, Métis Nation, Region 3. Perfect. I am Red River Métis from what is historically known as the Red River Settlement in Manitoba. My family is from Selkirk, Manitoba, which is just north of Winnipeg. I did go to school in Winnipeg, and I also taught in Winnipeg. Actually, Seven Oaks School Division is the school division that I graduated from, as well as that I taught in. I went to Winnipeg School Division for most of my life until my high school. For those who are Indigenous who are here, you know that the 2 questions we always ask each other are, what is your name? So we know who your people are, and where you're from, so we know what land you're from. So my people, my mother is a Mowat originally, and there's McDonald's, Mackays, and Beaudries in my family as well. We do have an Alberta connection. My family did live here for a time at Fort Edmonton and Fort Saskatchewan areas before moving back to Manitoba. And my great-grandpa, that's a picture from there, James Mowat. There's a school in Fort Saskatchewan, James Mowat Elementary, named after him in Mowat Park there. And then in Edmonton, there's James Mowat Trail. And Mowat is spelled with 2 T's in that situation, but I would say it's inventive spelling when it comes to when you move to a new country, because the name was actually spelled M-O-A-D with a Scottish accented D sounds like a T, and so the British wrote it down like that. In the Hudson Bay Company. Oh, thanks, guys. Yeah, lots more Treaty 7 and Treaty 6 people here. Perfect. Awesome. And beside that picture of my great-grandpa is a picture of my grandpa. He's the middle boy there, Rosser, and his 2 brothers and my great-aunt Tassie. And I think I would say I'm guesstimating that picture is probably around 1916, particularly the way they're dressed. I know they've got military clothes, because I'm sure that's what was available at the time. And my grandpa looks to be about 6 years old, I'm guessing. And the picture of my great-grandpa, I believe, is in the late 1800s. So I think those are cool pictures to have. I did put a little bit of information there about myself, about how I started teaching. I've worked in the area of special education a lot in my life, also with Indigenous students, and the 2 kind of go hand in hand a lot of the time, because Indigenous students often have gaps in learning, particularly if they've come from reserves into the city. You know, there'll be differences in what they've learned in terms of, you know, they may have gaps just because they didn't attend school very much, depending on their circumstances. And as well, there's a lot of unfortunately, because of different situations that have happened, abuse and intergenerational trauma, things like that, there tends to be a lot of learning disabilities, particularly back when I first started teaching. I think it's getting better, so it's good news. The reason I do this work is I actually, a couple of years ago, took a contract with Kataskanau Tribal Council, which is in Northern Alberta. It's 5 nations that came together to form an educational council, along with the Ignite e-learning online school. And I was tasked with taking their outreach program for grades 7 to 9 based upon the seasons, which was approved by Alberta Education. So it was fall, winter, spring, and then it was land-based learning, making sure that it was indigenized for their particular cultures, the Cree, and of course there's a variety amongst the people that were there in terms of their practice, and decolonize it, and as well add Cree language learning. And so I worked in concert with their specialists and learned a great deal from them, and they were of great help. And we, back and forth and got to the curriculum where they really liked it. It's an area that I love to work in. It's curriculum development. And the elders took it and they really loved what I did with it. And I was encouraged to continue on with this work. So I do curriculum development work in different areas, including with post-secondary. I work at Bow Valley College here in Calgary, doing some of their work with their programming. And I worked with the Edmonton SPCAs and do some work with them, and just various places that may want that assistance as well. But in this work with ELAL, what I'm doing is I'm really aiming at particularly non-Indigenous teachers who are wanting to become comfortable with this work, because I know it's part of the curriculum now, particularly in elementary, needing to use things like sharing circles and Indigenous ways of knowing and being, but not always knowing how to go about that with, doing it in a respectful way. And also, I know that most teachers do not want to, appropriate. And so that can be, kind of a tenuous situation. And how do we approach that? So my goal is to try to help teachers to feel more comfortable with that, and perhaps, give you the tools. And I like to give lots of resources in my presentations in terms of, where can you look? Because I have the time to do that research. So yeah, that's the basis of what I do. I'm going to look at the ARPDC resources first, because it's a really great place to start. These are resources that have already been, created by Alberta teachers, educators that either on secondment or working on directly with the different consortiums over the years. Empowering the Spirit is the first one I'm going to go to, which is, and I know I probably oversell this all the time. Maybe I don't, because I love this. It's not going to go there right now. I don't know what's going on. It's locked right now. But anyways, Empowering the Spirit is an amazing website that has really great resources on it. And when I'm doing research in this area, I find that this website is referenced all over the country. Literally, I'm not making that, it just is, especially with post-secondary institutions, particularly in the area of education. So their teacher education programs, a lot of the time you'll see this. Especially, like, I know UBC all over Alberta, going into Ontario even, I've seen it referenced in the eastern provinces. So, it's got some pretty good information here. It is specifically Alberta, so that's nice. I always say my favorite part of this is Orange Shirt Day and beyond, because there's some really cool stuff under teaching tools, particularly, and programming supports for schools. So not that I'm discounting the other stuff, because there's really great stuff there as well, but I like this because there's some ready-made posters you can print off for things like sharing circles and Orange Shirt Day, and just some really good visuals that you can pick up right away that are definitely Alberta based, and you can put those in your classroom. So if you have a chance to take a look at those. And then we're going to go back here, and then there are so many resources on this site that have been developed, like I said. Of course, I'm focusing on First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, so I'm going to go there. So if I click on that, of course, it's going to propagate just all of the resources that are available. Apologize for my dog. He's decided to be mouthy. He's a Shiba Inu. So you may notice, particularly Education is Our Buffalo. I know that's one I always saw when I was in schools physically. And Weaving Ways is a really great one as well. You can search by audience. You can search by level. And then you can search by type of resource. So there's lots of different ones on there. So yeah, it's just a great place to be able to start and to look for resources. If you're on the search for anything, it's a great spot to start. I want to start with why Indigenous storytelling is so important for Indigenous cultures across Turtle Island. And this is a very brief video, but I think it very succinctly, it's I think an auntie or mom teaching a young boy about Indigenous storytelling. So we'll just start there.
Why don't we write down our history? We have always had a lot of people who were speakers and leaders that told stories. and gave us our history through the spoken word. We hear stories over and over again to help us to understand why things come to be or why things happen the way they are now. So all of our history, it's very, very important to be listening to our elders so that the stories they tell us, we can hold on to and then pass on to our children.
Is there any other way that we could have recorded our history?
Yes, we have other ways of recording our history. Once we encountered the Europeans, we had to start recording our history using the wampum belts because we started having agreements, making agreements with them. And the only way that we were able to remember both sides, they were writing it down and we were recording it in our wampum belts. And it was also spoken in our language so that we would remember it. So we still have the oral version of the story of the wampum as well as the wampum itself so that you can see it written in the belts.
And so that's, when we're talking about wampum belts, we're talking about going into Ontario and Quebec area for people, but that's not to discount that there are definitely other ways of recording things or pictographs, and we know that things like that that are available at different places. There are sometimes things that are painted on the side of teepees or different dwellings and things like that that depicted stories. I have friends that often joke too. They're like, yeah, well, maybe, sometimes because Indigenous people have such a great sense of humor, sometimes it might have just been, some of the pictographs that they saw that people make a big deal out of may have just been jokes and things like that, which is a very good possibility as well. But we do know, right, that everything for Indigenous people, and even and I often say this too because I studied English when I was in university. Pre-20th century British literature is what I actually studied because my nana is English, and I was fascinated by it, especially Chaucer, because Chaucer was one of the first texts that we can find that was actually written down. Up until then, English itself was an oral language, and other than people taking the Bible and rewriting it over and over and over again and taking it, translating it into different languages, mainly being in Latin at the time, and then translating it into English with the King James Bible. I mean, all languages essentially were oral. The difference is that Indigenous languages still have been oral. They were not written down until people came to this country or came to Turtle Island period to North America. They didn't have a reason to write it down because if you think about it, I mean, anything that's written down anyways can be destroyed, but the memory, the things that we teach, that's why it's so important for Indigenous cultures. We say, I have this teaching and we share it with somebody. It's special because that's something that is probably thousands of years old that has been passed down by generation to generation. And now I'm sharing it with you as well. It's meant to be shared and passed down so that it continues. And that's the best way for memory and for information to be preserved, is to be told from one person to another, and we keep telling it to each other constantly. So it's very important to use. I guess get you guys to think a little bit. It can be hard to get everybody to participate online. I do my best when it's available. So we'll try this and see if anybody wants to add anything to the chat if you'd like to. What are some ways maybe that you have already honored Indigenous storytelling in your classrooms, or how do you think educators can honor Indigenous storytelling? You want to add? Maybe I'll wait a couple of seconds here, a few minutes, because I know it can take a while to put things into the chat. If you can think of anything that you have done or you may want to do. Okay, so we've got authentic authors sharing their stories. Awesome. Don't make it an add-on, right? Approach it genuinely. Awesome. Now I always say that. Make sure that it's authentic for sure. Invite an elder in. Yeah, that's a great way. Elders have great stories. They can tie everything together. They're amazing. Yeah, so those are some great ideas. If you guys think of anything else, you can definitely add it. I'm just going to go through some of the things that I just want to set kind of the tone for this, right? So we're going to get into the meat and bones of it, but I'd like to give you guys, in terms of pedagogy, as teachers, really some really good basics for what you should, avoid, those things for that you know, making sure it's authentic and avoiding that appropriation stuff, right? So one is, somebody did mention this, right? Use authentic text. So make sure that you're using, you know, authentic texts that are Indigenous for sure. And I know in here, right, it can be a challenge to identify those sometimes. So I do identify as well some really great websites that are Indigenous owned book, essentially bookstores online, like Strong Nations and Good Minds. There's also the Medicine Wheel Publishing. They should be vetted, right? They're owned by Indigenous people. So hopefully those particular ones are vetted in particular. It can be tricky ordering off of a place like Amazon. And I also encourage people to order off of Indigenous owned businesses as well, because then you are supporting the actual people that are doing this work. You know, I think Jeff Bezos, you know, I order stuff from Amazon as well, but he has enough of our money, just saying. You know, and then the FNESC also has published a resource guide. So that's something you can look at as well for use in K-7 classrooms. And that's something you can take a look at that gives you a real kind of basis for what you should be looking for. Also to understand too, different stories have different purposes. So you know, for instance, you know, like traditional contemporary First People stories are told for teaching. And so this is the important thing to understand as well. All of the stories have a purpose of some sort. You know, they're life lessons, obviously, you know, to keep us safe, right? So we're living in a harsh environment and we don't have indoor heating at this point, you know, and there's all kinds of not only wild animals, but wild weather and terrain. Think about living here when there was, like, I know in Calgary, there was a cold snap a couple of weeks ago when I think it went across the entire province and through the prairies, you know, and that sort of thing. People could die. And, you know, all of a sudden the weather to be changed when it's gone from really warm to cold. And if you're not prepared, so these stories are there to help you. There's also people that could possibly hurt you, right? Talking about community responsibilities. What are the things that we need to do to operate in our community in order for us to thrive and to be healthy as a group of people? So those stories are told. There's rites of passages, of course, right? There's different things that men go through and women go through and families go through in order to be successful in their lives. And it's not only that spiritual component, which you can never separate from Indigenous life when you talk about traditional life. There's also those sharing creation stories, right? There's personal stories, family and community stories. There's mapping the geography and resources of an area. Stories that ensure cultural continuity, so that knowledge is passed down from our ancestors. It goes through, like I said, you know, thousands of years. And then for healing and entertainment. So there's all these different ways that stories are told. It's also really important to understand copyright and protocol. So copyright and protocol are two different things. Copyright is very much, you know, that Western idea, and I'm not discounting it because it is important, right? Especially when we talk about protecting all people's work and artistic, you know, works. But in terms of Indigenous people, particularly because these stories were oral stories, and now if we're writing them down, and an aside as well, when we write them down, you cannot translate what is created within that First Nations language into English. There's something lost in translation to begin with. So they're never quite going to be the same as those oral stories. I myself am learning Cree. My grandpa, being Métis, those who are Scottish and British Métis mostly spoke Cree. It was the French Métis that spoke Michif primarily. And the Cree language itself, in learning it, is amazing and beautiful and insightful and related to nature in a way that English can never be. And there's something that's lost when you translate that, unfortunately. So that's one thing to understand. But that copyright's still to protect those stories, because some of them may be, like I said, thousands of years old. The other thing is to always make sure that there's a protocol, right? So we want to make sure that you follow that protocol, and the protocol is generally to ask permission always. And I always say this to people: in Indigenous cultures, you ask permission first. Do not go ahead and do whatever you'd like to do and then beg for forgiveness later. It's highly disrespectful. And it's I mean, people aren't, I shouldn't say, I don't know how to explain it. It's not like anybody's ever going to be super mad at you, but it's an affront. And it's, so we always ask permission first, no matter what it is. And the thing is, storytelling exists within not just stories itself, the oral stories or published stories. It also exists in dance. It exists in the music. So, you know, all of those things are forms of not only storytelling, but a form of spirituality and prayer. And so it's really important to make sure that you get permission for these different things. So if you're attending an event or something like that, and you hear a story and you'd like to, let's say, share it, or a specific dance or something special goes on, I always just ask permission. It's always the best thing to do. And then that way you know where you stand, right? Story, legend, and myth. And so I really want to, this is, I guess, a personal annoyance of mine, just because of an experience I had when tutoring a student. He was in ESL, and he was, it doesn't really matter which language he was learning, but his teacher, and I'm sure the teacher, like I said, we all try to save time, had taken the story off the internet, obviously, because it said Native American animal myths as well. So obviously it was an American PDF that she or he did not change. And it did say myths. And so I always say avoid that, because what is a myth or legend to you with Indigenous stories is not necessarily that to Indigenous peoples, because there's that spiritual element. Not only that, there's that element of animism. And so animism occurs in all stories. So, you know, where you may think, you know, well, this is obviously a myth or a legend because there's an animal speaking in it. Well, to us, that could be our ancestors speaking to us, or it could actually be spirit speaking through that animal. So, and not only that, everything does have a spirit as far as we're concerned when you're talking about traditional Indigenous practice. And I myself practice Cree spirituality, and so that is part of the belief system. So it's just really important to understand that when you're explaining it to kids. So it's a question in the chat. If you wouldn't use myth to describe your history, don't use it to describe someone else's. That, yeah, exactly. Like, think about it this way. For instance, if I was to say to you, as because I grew up in church and I went to church most of my life, if I was to say to you that the story of Christ was a myth, I know a whole lot of people who would be really up at arms and feel disrespected, rightfully so. That is their belief, and they have the right for that to be respected. And so I say that the same as with Indigenous beliefs. The stories that are told, just refer to them as stories or traditional stories. To refer to it as a legend or a myth is the same idea as saying that sort of thing, right? Okay, yeah, so you get the, yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, same idea, right? So just being, and the thing is too about Indigenous spirituality is that you respect all people's belief systems too. So somebody who's Indigenous who practices traditional spirituality would never think to say that to somebody else either about their beliefs, right? Because that's your journey, that's your path. And so we're not going to say that to you. I think another important thing to remember is that if you've encountered an unfamiliar, and this is, I'm taking this from an online, so obviously it's a little bit older Aboriginal, and it is off the FNESC website. So Indigenous people still do use Aboriginal, Indigenous interchangeably, just like Native. And I know for the rest of you, it's a bit safest to stick to Indigenous, quite honestly, but in terms of, that's why that word is there, just in case you're wondering. And I know people come across a word and they're afraid they'll be disrespectful if they mispronounce it. What should you do? I apologize, that would be my dog. Hush. Oh my God. If anybody's ever owned a Shiba Inu, they understand. There are apps out there. So if you're going to use a book and you want to know how to pronounce the word, you can get the apps. Now, the other thing I'm going to tell you, because I'm learning Cree, there's different pronunciations for things too, depending on where you live. So like the elders that are teaching me Cree, they're from Saskatchewan. And some of their pronunciation of some words is very different than even here. But you just know when you meet people, as long as you kind of got the same general idea in a sentence or pronunciation, that they're going to understand what you're talking about. They'll be like, oh yeah, you've learned from somebody who's over there, or you're from this area, and they'll know that. But there's also books online too, like on YouTube. There's lots of stories, especially for young ones. I know for a lot of the books that are Machif, that you can, and I'm going to show you one of those actually in here for lesson plan. And it'll read it in English and it'll read it in Machif. So there's also those kind of options as well if you want to try to find those. But if you have a language from your local area and you're working on that, because I always say go local first, try to use what's from your area and the land of the people that have always lived there, even if they were displaced from that area and no longer live there. Try to use their stuff first. But you know what? Invite somebody in as a speaker of that language if you'd like them to do some of that as well, if you're able to. And like I said, there's, understanding the language is super important, right? So storytelling and language, and this is the truth. There's no way to separate Indigenous languages from their stories. There's often, and you guys know this too, if you speak another language other than English, you're going to know this, and this is why English borrows from so many different languages as well, right? There's so many different languages that are mixed into English that are words that we use on a regular basis, because English has lots of words, but it takes a lot of words to describe something effectively. That's one of the reasons that poetry is so interesting in English, I think. This is particularly true of Indigenous languages. And all of the stories are connected to the land, to nature, history, and spirituality. And so and I'm talking traditional stories, right? We're not talking necessarily new ones. And again, I put a caveat here for you guys to understand. Again, stories that are published or shared with you by permission from the people of origin are fine to use. Stories that are specific to a group or family are not to be shared, as these are part of their legacy, more than physical objects that are passed down in families. So always ask permission if you're unsure. So just always check. And even if you find something online and you're not quite sure, contact that person and find out. I think if they put it online, they probably want to share it. But I just, out of protocol, I just always ask them permission. I'm not going to show you all of this stuff because I just don't have time to get into it. But I think that elder storytelling is really important to understand because elders have an amazing way of telling stories. And one I want to point out, especially for the young ones, is Elder Hazel. And this is just a list of basically all the videos that are available for her. And I often show her stuff. She's through the Royal Saskatchewan she works at the museum there, and I think she works at the university as well. But she's got lots of stories in here. I just want to point this out if you're looking at some of the younger ones. And she just has such a gentleness to her, an amazing way of telling stories. And I think she's just a great example of somebody who is a great elder at telling stories. You've used them. Yeah, she's so amazing. I just love her. She's just so sweet and gentle. And I think she's just a really great example for kids too of what an Indigenous elder is like when they tell stories. And then again, this is empowering the spirit. So I thought I would share this too, that there is a section on here that is all about storytelling, and there's foundational knowledge on here. And there's also a literacy seed kit that can be used. And this is, of course, for some of the little bit older kids. And of course, we're looking at, elementary across the board, right? So, and then they do have some information on there about infusing Indigenous texts in the classroom. And then there's some videos in there, and I have used some of these in some of my other sessions, but just on Indigenous storytelling that might help you as well, give you some more information. I don't have time to go through all of that today. I do cover it, like I said, in some other sessions. You guys do know, obviously, the English Language Arts and Literature, the new ELA curriculum, and there's, I've got a link there to the synopsis of that. Looking at, where can we fit this into the curriculum, particularly when we're talking about Indigenous storytelling? Well, there's that focus on literature, of course, right? So we have the opportunities to enjoy a variety of texts. So we're talking about all different cultures and groups of people. Indigenous peoples being, the first peoples here in Canada. Of course, we want to imbue our curriculum as much as possible with those texts. Oral communication, of course, is a big one. That active listening, presenting, and then drama. And a lot of this can occur in things like sharing circles. And again, I do separate sessions on that to get into that. We talk about the writing part. We can do storyboarding and story organization with the kids about that. And I think the other part of it to really understand is that Indigenous storytelling is a very different format than, say, Western types of storytelling. And you can compare that even to other storytelling that you might use from other cultures right around the world and compare all of those and how are they different. You can even talk about, Indigenous stories from Africa. In a lot of ways, there's some similarities, I would say, probably, and including stories from Australia and New Zealand in terms of structure in Indigenous storytelling. And then that text form, right, using digital, online, and the books. So those are those areas in the new curriculum we can look at. Again, I wanted to show you guys where you could find literature. So where can you find some really good resources for this? So, I mean, won't spend too much time on each one of these, but you know, looking at Our Spirit Soar is a really great website. This is kind of pedagogical background for you guys. And it does reference Dr. Joanne Archibald on here. And I do use one of her videos when I do storytelling in a different session. Oh, Storytelling by Elder Hazel. Actually, just search on YouTube, Carol. If you there, you'll get the link for this. But yeah, if you just search Elder Hazel on YouTube, it'll come up for sure. She's got that whole thing that I showed you is just me searching on her name, and it came up to put the link in. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Christine. So if you have time and you want to check out Dr. Joanne Archibald, she's through UBC, and she has done a lot of work in this area in terms of Indigenous storytelling and, you know, just the difference in the storytelling, all that kind of stuff. But this is really what she focused on here was using it to teach social and emotional learning, you know, empathy and intercultural understanding. And then there's a whole bunch of links. Again, it even points to, again, the Literacy Seed Kit website too, and here's Strong Nations. And there's a bunch of bibliographies of different books that you can look at as well for different areas. Looking at Strong Nations too is a really, I love this website. Oh, thanks, Mac. Yeah, Joanne Archibald is amazing. Yeah, she's done amazing work, truly. Devoted her life to this. It's amazing. And yeah, so anyway, just to look at here, you can search on children's books, and it does go by, you know, the different grade levels if you want to do that as well. But it also, you know, goes by the different areas that you can look at. And so this is searching on kids' books came up with this, but you can definitely go to different areas. So that's a really good website to look at. And then this is Métis books, and this is through the Gabriel Dumont Institute. And people are always, I know for myself, I always like to point out, obviously because I am Métis, I like to point out that there are some really amazing books that are here at the Gabriel Dumont Institute, and the Rupert Sand Institute as well has been developing that. Good Minds, again, like I referenced this, an amazing website, and I love their search engine on here. This is actually, compared to Strong Nations, even it's that much better, because you can go by the books, you can go by children and teen and adults, but if you look at children, look at that, if you go down, it breaks it down all to all the different areas, and they even have like the leveled readers. They've got land-based learning, picture books, preschool, like they've got everything on here when you just look at that. So just, it's a really great search engine, and they got so many books. And then there's the First Nations Development Institute. And they always have book recommendations on here, and they have people doing it in a blog style. So that's always really nice. And then they've got a list, and they go through, sorry, it just flipped me up to the top. They go through, you know, based on all these different areas too. So you can look at, you know, if you're looking for yourself for books of reference, but also for kids, etc. Like, so PD, there's tons of stuff there. French, First Nations, Métis. Yeah, okay, so that's a bit of a trick. Other than, I know the Métis ones, they do come in Michif as well. That is a bit more of a challenge, I'll tell you honestly, to find them in French as well. So if I find any of those, I will definitely let you know. But I know ARPDC is at least trying to develop more materials that are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit that are also available en français, but that's a work in progress. Most of them right now, if you can get them in English and their original language, is probably what you're going to have to focus on. So this is, again, another list, and I'm not going to go through it all entirely, but I just want you to see that it's there. And then I've got another list for you as well. So just the vetted books, and giving you some of that information if you want to take a look. And I like this one too, because it does have a picture of the book. It gives you the grade level, gives you a synopsis, all that kind of stuff. And you know, really helps you understand. And there's a lot of them, as you can see, that have they're very sensitive subjects, right? There, a lot of them deal with residential schools and things like that, and for kids, and they try to approach it in a, you know, at least a way that you can give it to kids and it's not so scary. I do want to go through this lesson plan, so I'll show you Leah Dorian. I love her. During Orange Shirt Day, I was actually so pleased that I got to host her the day that she was online, and got to actually host a discussion with her. So I was kind of what do you call it? I can't remember the term, but anyways, I was kind of smitten over the whole situation. But this is the story, and I want to show you because it is in English and Michif. And I'm not going to do the Michif version, but go through the story mostly with you, and then go through the lesson plan with you so you can see how this will fit in. And of course, I picked for me a Métis one because I am Métis. Let's let it.
The Giving.
I'm just going to let it spool first so it doesn't stop constantly. So just so you see, so it is in English first, and then they do go through and do it in Michif. So this is one of those examples that I wanted to show you where you can get both versions of the story.
A retelling of a traditional Métis story about giving and receiving. Written and illustrated by Leah Dorian, Michif translation by Norman Fleury. A long time ago, there was once a tree. It was an old, twisted Manitoba maple. This Manitoba maple was special. She had a large, weathered hollow within her trunk. Maybe this hollow was once home to a family of birds, or it might have been the sleeping place for a traveling porcupine. One thing for certain, this tree was beloved by my grandpa. Grandpa often called her the giving tree. So I asked my grandpa to tell me a story from his childhood memories. He said, long ago, when I was a little boy, my mama and papa often traveled by horse and wagon to visit our relations. My favorite part of our trip was the pipe break at the Giving Tree. This tree was located at the halfway point between our related Métis villages. It was the Métis way to stop for tea and bannock at the Giving Tree. As small kids, we got very excited at the sight of the tree as she appeared around the bend in the trail. It was our tradition to sprinkle an offering of tobacco at the base of her trunk every time we visited the tree. It was fun to unload our wagon for a friendly family picnic under her protective canopy. We loved to make a small fire, to boil our tea, cook our bannock, gather around to tell stories, and to chew on our dry meat. The most magical memory that I have was the time when my mama forgot to pack our sugar into the grub box. Oh my goodness gracious, said Mama, I forgot to pack sugar for our tea and bannock. Son, spoke Papa, come here. I want you to help me with something. So Papa lifted me up to look into the big hollow within the maple tree. To my surprise, in the bottom of the hollow, there was sugar, tea, bundles of tobacco, letters, flour, and even a pair of moccasins. There was so much stuff hidden deep inside her hollow. I was awestruck as I pulled out a little canister of sugar. As Papa lowered me down, I said, Papa, what's all that stuff doing in there? My Papa explained to me that this giving tree is a sacred place for us Métis people. He told me that for generations, the tree hollow was used by Métis travelers as a cache, so that it could help our people out in times of need. My Papa said that it was the Métis way to use the tree cache as a message center and as an emergency supply stash. For generations, the tree cache was a symbol of honesty and respect. Papa told me that once a young man left an engagement ring for his sweetheart inside the tree. 2 days later, the ring was delivered to his sweetheart safely by a man passing by her home. Papa loved our old Métis ways. Papa spoke of our beliefs. If you take something from the tree cache, you are responsible to put something back in return. Papa reminded me that it is our Métis way to be kind, generous, and helpful to others. Mama came over to the tree to get the sugar canister. She put several folded polka-dotted hankies and a small pail into my hand so I could offer them back into the hollow. Mama thought that somebody might find the hankies useful, especially if they had a runny nose or needed a rag. It was so fun to place our offering back into the maple tree. I wondered who would someday get those polka-dotted hankies. That day, I understood why the old-timers called her the giving tree, as she stood for everything good that we Métis people believed in. As Grandpa finished his story, he smiled, winked, and made me promise to one day tell my own children the story of the giving tree. He said, "Tell our stories so future generations will remember about the true spirit of being Métis."
Log commented.
Yeah, so briefly, you got to hear there for just a second as somebody was reading it and mentioned. So I think too in that story, what if you look at the visuals too, which is really nice, is that they have very much she's very much drawn and colored in the difference in the different colors in people as well too, right? They're indigenous, particularly amongst the Métis. I myself am very fair. My grandpa was darker, but he married a woman who was Swedish and English, and so then you got us, right? So my mother looked like her Swedish grandfather. But I very much have, as you could see from the pictures at the very beginning, family that's very much indigenous looking. But amongst the Métis particularly, you have people that are all different shades and colors, right? So she's included that, which I think is amazing. It also happens with First Nations people. There's First Nations people. I have cousins that are First Nations because my great aunt Tassie, the picture you saw at the beginning, who was very indigenous looking, she married a man as well who was Cree from a reserve that was close to Selkirk, and but some of my cousins in that family are actually fairer than I am. So there is that. I think it's nice for kids, especially they're indigenous, that might be in your classrooms, to see that, right? Because that they could identify with that a lot more. The other thing is you'll notice too some of the language that's used, particularly for instance the offering, right? That is something that is used within indigenous culture too, to say like I give an offering, for instance, if you're in a sweat lodge, like you give tobacco, or you give a gift to an elder, things like that. And those are also terms that are used by Christians too, right? But in a different way. And so there's kind of that language that can be shown as well, which is kind of, I think, an interesting little piece. But then I like that too, like I said, because it has a Michif version as well if you wanted to. And I know many of you live in the northern part of Alberta. There's a lot of Métis settlements there. This is a really wonderful lesson plan, and it's very detailed, of course, because it was done by a student for their graduate work at U of C at Workland, and she just did a whole lot based on this entire story, which is just great. So it's a great resource, and I just thought I'd show this as an example, and really looking at two kind of looking at Indigenous ways of knowing and being, looking at Western knowledge, right? And how do we do with this learning, and looking at recalling events and characters. And generally, that is what is required of students in Western knowledge for storytelling. But traditional storytelling and knowledge requires, these ideas, right? In terms of the story, is that what you're learning from the story. So taking only what you need, offering and sharing the spirit, learning about that equality of men and women within Indigenous cultures. And when I say that, I mean that we still have different roles, not to discount that, but there is a certain equality in terms of respect and give and take in those relationships. So I don't want people to think that, all Indigenous culture thinks that we're all equal in terms of our roles necessarily, but, traditionally things were a little bit different. But there is that idea of equality in terms of our worth to creator in that idea. But anyways, there's lots of these different, it's really nice because she's got lots of great ideas for kids to use a story, and really, and I know some of these outcomes are older, but the outcomes, I think, for the new curriculum is actually easier even to fit things in, because it's a lot more general. So I think that's one of the nice things that's flexible about that curriculum. And there's lots of visuals in here as well. So she's included some really cool stuff. But yeah, I include that because I think that that's a really cool resource to have and gives you just a really good idea of, you know, how you could use that. Kind of try to start to wrap this up a little bit so we can have a little bit of time for discussion if you'd like. Talking about that oral communication, and that storytelling is generally done in a sharing circle or talking circle is what, you know, Western culture calls it. And it's a really great tool to teach children how to actively listen and share in this way. And it's also part of the curriculum now, as I understand it. And that can be used in ELAL as well. And there's protocols for sharing circles. And I did put a link in there for that, as well as there are on empowering the spirit. There are protocols that you can print out. I also included a lesson plan that is specifically about Indigenous storytelling, and it can be used from young grades up to grade 8. So the really young ones, you can start with there, but it really incorporates what is storytelling from kindergarten to grade 8 using a KWL. You can, and I want everybody to avoid using a talking stick, and I'm gonna just kind of put this out there. That is an appropriation issue unless you've received it from an Indigenous person or purchased it from an Indigenous person. So if you've been gifted or you've bought it from them, it's best to avoid that. Use a feather or a rock or something like that in the sharing circle. It just kind of gives you some information about Indigenous storytelling, what you could incorporate to teach the kids, and just again those protocols for doing that. And then I've got a couple links in here as well to look at oral storytelling. There's a learning plan in there as well for some of the older kids, and then just using talking circles in the classroom. I really think it's important to look at also Indigenous, you know, especially First Nations storytelling as a way to teach oral communication, which we don't use necessarily in Western culture. Again, using that dramatic expression, using somebody like that Elder Hazel, because she does a really great job of that. You know, like an elder knowledge keeper would do, getting the kids to mimic that and telling stories gives them more than just being dramatic in a dramatic or drama class. Using it for problem solving, right? We can use stories for problem solving. We can have discussions around them in this circle, and we can have decision making as well through oral communication. And then those ideas for writing, right? We can model from Indigenous stories because there is a different format, there's a different flow. I often compare it to something like Aesop's Fables. I remember when I was a child, we would read the Aesop's Fables in school. That was kind of the go-to. I'm a lot older, you know, back in the day. And then it has a definite, what is the moral of the story? What is it teaching you? There's a specific answer. Indigenous stories are open-ended, and they're meant for you as the listener, no matter what age you are, to really start to think on your own and make those decisions for your own journeys. So they're not as closed as, say, an Aesop's Fable, right? You can also use these for researching. There's a really good springboard for looking at different First Nations, Métis, Inuit ideas and things. You can make posters, obviously, newspaper articles, doing that story writing, storyboard planning, and I think really comparing it to the difference in how is Indigenous storytelling different from Western storytelling that they may have had experience with. And then journaling about an Indigenous story too that they could respond to. Obviously for writing, there's lots of different areas that we can look at. Again, a lot of the post-secondary institutions have amazing resource lists, so I encourage you to look there too if you haven't thought about doing that. And there's just a couple, like University of Calgary, just they've got so much stuff on here. This is just one of their websites, right? And they've got lists of books, but they also have this amazing search engine too. So that's a place you can look if you're wanting to get specific ideas for stories as well. And then the Canadian Encyclopedia, I put in this as, you know, more a little bit of pedagogy, but do never discount this website. It has some amazing stuff on it, including this one has a teacher's guide for primary art and writing activities and arts and story templates when it comes to Indigenous art and storytelling too. So there's lots of really good stuff on there. And then text form, right? So looking at book form, like there's, oh shoot, sorry, I don't know why I did that. Oh, sorry, it went back to, I linked it that way. Sorry. Okay, look at the digital resources. Oh my goodness. Still not adjusted to this time change, I have to say. So I just wanted to give you guys a list of, these are Indigenous read alouds that are here. There's a whole here, you can go through and play through them. but on this side, there's a whole list of stories as well. So there's definitely stuff that's available online if you're looking for that sort of thing. Some really great stuff, and read by Indigenous storytellers most of the time. And then I wanted to include for you guys just some background information for yourselves, some pedagogy that you can look at these links, but just really looking at why it's important for Indigenous people to own their stories, right? After colonization, and many stories have been lost, and things will never get back, unfortunately. And, it's really important that we honor those traditions. I'm Métis, I'm not First Nations, I'm not Inuit, so I never ever profess to understand that, and really try to pay homage to those people. And I do have Cree cousins as well in my family, and really just looking at myself being super careful in how I approach those things too. So just some background information for you guys to look at. Yeah, and so I'm gonna stop recording so that we can